Hello YouTube, I am Faninder. In the previous tutorial, we have seen how the execution goes on when we inherit and initialize an object of derived class. So in this tutorial, I will explain about super keyword. So for better understanding, I'll just rename these classes so that you don't get confused. So now I'll rename the class as something like test1, and I will rename the derived class as test2. Test2 extends test1. So let me save this file. Test1.java, and I will save this file as test2.java. So now let us go to the test1 class, that is base class. In this class we have two data members I and j and a default constructor. Now I will define another constructor, that is parameterized constructor. Why? Let me rename this class name as test and test1. Sorry, this is test1. And it is going to take parameters as int I comma int j, and we will set the values as this dot I equals. We have learned about this in our previous tutorials. This dot j equals j. So I'm not going to explain about this in this tutorial. So what this statement does is it will just set the values of the data members I and j to the values that we pass to it, and in the derived class, that is test2, test2, we have one default constructor. Now I will define another constructor, public test2, and this is also going to take parameters as integer type int a comma int b, and this is also going to set this dot a equals a, this dot b equals b. So, and also I want to copy all this code so that we can print the values directly when we Control C, Control V, and same thing in here. Control C, Control V. So I will now go to the execution class and just I will initialize an object of test2. Test2. So we have seen what happens when we compile and run this file. The control goes to the default constructor of test2, and the JVM internally calls the default constructor of base class of this test2. That is, the base class of test2 class is test1, and the default constructor of test1 class is going to execute over here. So this is when we initialize the object by using the default constructor. So what happens when we initialize the object by using parameterized constructor? In test2 class we have a parameterized constructor which takes two objects A and B of integer type. So what happens when we initialize using that? So let me do that. I will just pass the values as 100, 200, and I will save the file. I will save this file also, test2 class and test2, test1. So what happens when we now I will go to the command prompt and compile all the files, test1.java and javac, test2.java and javac, demo.java. So I compile all the files. Now let me run the file and show you Java demo. So look at here. We have initialized the object obj with respect by using parameterized constructor of test2. So in this test2 class we haven't written any code to call its base class constructor, but check the result in here. It says that I am from base class and it's printing the values of ing. So this is the base class. Let me see. This is the base class default constructor and it is printing the values of ing. So remember I said that when we initialize an object with respect to default constructor, the control goes to the default constructor of that class, and if it is inheriting the features of some other class, the JVM simply transfers the control to the base class and executes the default constructor of base class and then returns to the default constructor of derived class, executes the code in it, and so on. The same case repeats in parameterized constructor also. When we initialize an object with respect to parameterized constructor, so the control comes to the parameterized constructor of derived class, and since this class is inheriting the features of base class, the JVM transfers the control to default constructor of base class, that is test1, and it is going to execute it, and after executing, the control again returns back to parameterized constructor of derived class. So similarly, the result in here, first the base class default constructor is going to execute, and then the derived class default constructor is going to execute. So now I don't want to call the base class default constructor, but I want the the parameters constructor of base class to get executed whenever I create an object with respect to parameters constructor of derived class. That is, whenever I create an object, I want to call the parameters constructor of base class. So what I have to do, I'll just go to class default parameters constructor and say something as super. This calls the default constructor of base class, but I want to call the default constructor parameters constructor of base class. So I will say simply as 15, 20. So we are passing some parameters to it. So the parameters constructor, this parameters constructor is going to be executed. So let me do some modifications and save this file, and I will go to the command prompt. I will compile the file again, and now I will run the file. Java the demo. So look at here, it has executed as we have expected. The control first goes to parameters constructor of base class, and it will execute the values, or it will initialize the values of I and j, and just printed it in here. I am from base class parameters constructor, and again the control comes back to parameters constructor of derived class, and it will execute the rest of the code in it. So this is with parameters constructor. So remember, the super keyword is used to call the constructor of base class. If you are passing any parameters to it, it will call the parameters constructor of respected parameters. I want to initialize the values using default constructor, but I want to initialize the values using default constructor in derived class, but I want to call the parameters constructor of base class. That is, when I initialize the test, when I initialize an object of test2 class, I want the default constructor of test2 class to get executed, but I want the parameters constructor of test1 class to get executed. We have seen that if we don't use any keyword in here, it will simply call the default constructor of base class. So I will write super of 100,000 comma 2 or 2000. So this statement calls the parameters constructor of base class from the default constructor of derived class. So let me again save the file and go to the command prompt, compile the file again, and run the file. So it has executed as we have expected. First the control has gone to the parameters constructor of base class, and it initialized the values and printed on the screen, and similarly executed the rest of the statement in default constructor of derived class. I hope you understood what I wanted to say. So that's all for today on Super Keyboard. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.